Thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. My name is Amanda Eversole and I am Chief Operating Officer of the American Petroleum Institute. And we are so proud to sponsor today's Titan Talk, featuring a distinguished panel of energy experts and transformational business leaders. With the many issues facing our nation today, of course, we must remain focused on balancing our long-term energy demand and addressing climate change. We know the world's energy needs will only increase with time. We also know that it's critical to meet the growing demand while reducing the risks of climate change. The good news is that the US natural gas and oil industry has proven that we can do both. The industry is serious about developing climate solutions and has been focused for decades on innovation and new technology to reduce environmental footprint. To advance the unified climate approach even further, API recently released a new climate action framework, which is designed to guide government and industry towards a brighter future. The 5-point framework outlines the opportunity of our time, enabling the industry to build on its track record of energy leadership and environmental stewardship. It also builds on API's Energy Excellence, a critical new program that unified our industry's approach to operating improvements, safety, and sustainability. You can learn more at api.org. API advocates for this industry and sets standards for operational quality because we know the important role our industry plays in the years ahead. That wouldn't work and wouldn't be possible without the partners like you on this call, driven business leaders and energy advocates who are working together for a better future. Thank you so much. I look forward to a great discussion today from today's very impressive list of speakers. Thank you so much.
So I think I go from here, Meredith. So before we really even start, I just wanted to give a call out to Drayton McLean, who I saw was on, and also Paul Foster may be on because Texas had a big win last night. And more importantly for those esteemed gentlemen, Baylor's first national championship win in the history of the school. Got some guys who worked the bullpen outside, and it was a very green day yesterday. But it's a pleasure to moderate this panel. I'm very excited to hear from these panelists and to have them answer the questions that I know everybody has. And they really need no introduction, and each has a very diverse perspective on the energy industry and a deep understanding of the issues and challenges that the industry is facing today. So our esteemed panelists, let's start with Bill White, a friend and former mayor of Houston and former deputy energy company and former Department of Energy, who's going to talk from a policy perspective and has been closely following what the Biden administration has been doing and perhaps trying to sort of divine what they are going to do. Then Kelsey Warren, who I had the honor to meet here just in the chat room beforehand, founder of Energy Transfer Partners, who's been a visionary leader in the industry and a force to be recognized with, and he can share his views from a midstream and infrastructure perspective. We've also got Bobby Chuter, who I've most likely known for too long, and he is co-founder of Chuter, Pickering and Holt, has a long career in the industry, and has also seen many cycles and is one of the more thoughtful, recognized leaders, and he can share his thoughts on where the upstream industry is headed. And then finally, Will Van Loo, who is the founder of Quantum Energy, no introduction needed on that company, who's enjoyed an incredibly successful career investing in companies in the energy industry, and is keenly aware of the headwinds that the industry is facing. Everyone's eager to hear from you, so I'm going to sort of pose the questions and ask that you sort of respond to the first question in the order in which we introduced you. But it's really about energy transition. Every day we are seeing these headlines, we're seeing people talk about energy transition. It seems to mean so many different things to different people, it's politicized. But what does energy transition really look like in terms of timeline, affordability, and our economy as a whole? So Bill, let's start with you.
You know, Amanda, thanks for inviting me for this distinguished panel. Look, I've resisted the idea of calling something energy transition for a while because the transition has been going on, as the industry participants know, for some time. Natural gas has been displacing coal, renewables have been picking up steam in jurisdictions across the world, including the United States. And my home state of Texas, our home state of Texas, for quite a while. There is always this balance between emissions that include both greenhouse gas emissions and other emissions from the combustion of hydrocarbons. And as you mentioned, affordability to the consumer. And finally, a whole cluster of issues that you could define as security, reliability, range of vehicles. Again, nothing new. I remember, the second State of the City address I gave as mayor emphasized the need to balance these issues and for our community and for the industry to be a leader in how we balance those issues. There is, and it is not the end of the hydrocarbon industry, because consumers themselves and voters balance those issues that include affordability and reliability and security. Transitions take a long time to happen. They do it by incremental steps. Certainly the build out of the, Kelsey, the natural gas trunk line industry took 25, 30 years to occur after World War II. And this transition will occur over a extended period of time. What is perhaps new is that we encounter, daily in the practice in dealing with energy companies is the level of institutional investor interest and how companies will cope with this, what its significance for the company is. So some of these ESG screens we can talk about in more detail later. And it does pose issues, challenges to managements of energy companies. I mean, the fact of the matter is, $4 out of $5 every year globally on oil is spent to replace depletion. So if peak oil occurs in 2027 or 2032, there's going to be a robust and vital global oil industry. There's no question about that. But companies are having to weigh a little bit, particularly some of the larger super major and the national companies, national champion companies, if they want to participate in new forms of energy versus sticking with their core competence. So with that, to keep within a 3-minute limit, those are my thoughts on energy transition.
Thank you, Bill. Kelsey, do you want to pick up from here?
Sure. When I first came into the industry, and by the way, thank you for having me. I really appreciate this. The Fuel Use Act had just been passed by the federal government, and there was a lot in the Fuel Use Act, but the primary thing that mattered was that there was a mandate for all new power generation to be built in the United States must be fueled by coal and not natural gas or alternative fuels. So we were an industry in transition. I love what Bill said. We've been, ever since I've been doing this, we're always in transition. And now we fast forward today, Energy Transfer has invested tens of billions of dollars in infrastructure. I mean, clearly we believe in the industry and we believe in the sustainability of the industry, and we're going to continue doing that. So I also, by the way, support, I'm glad we're making electric vehicles. I'm glad people have a choice. We own Sunoco. Sunoco, I have a wealth of data that I look at every day. And some of the data that I thought I'd mention that just stands out is 80% of all new vehicles purchased in the last several years, over 80% are heavy vehicles, or trucks or SUVs or things of that nature. That's interesting to me to study the buyer. Also, a statistic I find really fascinating is an average vehicle that enters the fleet will stay there 12 years on average, and a little bit over 12 years on average. About 2% of EVs occupy the market right now, and I'm sure that number is growing. But we're watching it closely, and we don't see anything near any kind of major change in the industry for quite some time. And then finally, the part of your question about how do we pay for this, the one that makes me scratch my head the most is everybody on this call knows that when you go and fill up your car with gasoline or diesel, whatever the case may be, you pay a huge amount of your bill is actually federal and state and local taxes, a very large amount of that. Well, those dollars are going to need to be replenished. And on average, a vehicle driver, let's say they could be a family, but the vehicle driver will pay about $500 to $800 a year in taxes to fuel their car. That supposedly goes into improving our infrastructure, improving our roads, our highways, that type of thing. Those dollars got to come back. And so it's not exactly clear to me as let's say we were to get to 5% of vehicle use that would be EVs, then it's not clear to me how that will get paid for. And so I'd like to see that at some point.
I think many people are grappling with, so many practical aspects of what energy transition means and the time frame. Bobby, you've been in this industry a long time, and you've sort of seen things come and go, and some things succeed and some things fail. Where do you think this is?
Well, another issue that we're grappling with is just one of capital. And on its face, we look at what's going on in the U.S. and the amount of money that appears to be, whether it's via directed ESG investing or SPACs oriented at batteries, or you name it. It seems like there's plenty of capital around to help fund this transition. But according to the IEA, to be on track to meet the goals of Paris, we need to be spending somewhere between $3 and $4 trillion a year, every year for the next decade to meet those goals. And we're currently spending about $500 billion. So we have a big gap when it comes to capital. The market and the press is mostly focused on the capital allocation of the super major oil companies and whether they are redirecting capital towards different forms of energy, non-hydrocarbon related energy. And most of them are, but in the context of being $2.5 trillion short a year, it's simply a drop in the bucket, frankly. So there are still very big questions here around who is going to fund this transition and how aggressively governments are willing to be around that. And of course, what that ultimately goes to is tax regimes. So the capital issues around the energy transition are very, very significant. Our observation is that when we talk to companies, traditional hydrocarbon-based energy companies in the US, so upstream oil and gas companies, oilfield services companies, pipeline companies, et cetera, whose business remains highly tied to hydrocarbon production and transportation. How they think about this varies pretty dramatically. And it tends to be driven by a handful of different things. One, what their core competencies are. Two, what their balance sheet is. Three, what their shareholders want from them. And so you get a very wide range of how people are kind of approaching it as regards the mix of their business. On the whole, the true capital reallocation away from core business competencies towards these new products in extant hydrocarbon-based companies is actually quite low. And we don't see a massive shift in that regard, at least in the intermediate term. There is a lot of new capital formation for new companies, and we are expecting a lot of innovation in that regard, and it's very exciting, and there's a lot of great stuff happening. But relative to the scale of the problem, it's still quite small. So we have a very, very long way to go. Sometimes it's easy to get discouraged about how far we have to go. But I do think there's a broad recognition in the traditional hydrocarbon energy business that the world needs a lower carbon energy system. And that if we're going to get there, then those companies are going to have to play a critical role in helping us get there. I'll pause there, Amanda.
I think that's right, Bobby. One thing I was going to point out, I'm president and chief operating officer of Solaris Water. And the CEO of our company and the founder is actually Bill Zartler, who's most likely on this call, who was a former scholar and is now on the board of directors. And we just were successful in issuing, and we funded on April Fool's Day, so we hope it's very auspicious, last week, a $400 million sustainability-linked bond. And it is the first SLB in the oil and gas industry, or as we are saying, in the produced water infrastructure industry, because having it in the oil and gas industry was obviously something you have to be very careful about. And so I think, we're very proud of that, but I think it's also indicative of the challenges that this industry has, the whole concept of sustainability, and the fact that this is the first and most likely for a while the only sustainability, linked bond for the industry. But everybody is looking to find their way going forward as to how they're going to differentiate, how they are going to manage this transition when people are looking at the industry in many respects in a fairly negative way. Will, you have got a phenomenal career behind you, have built and sold and created so much value in the upstream sector, but at the same time, you've also been fairly vocal recently about the transition. So look forward to seeing what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. So, I think for many people, the term energy transition it's a pretty narrow definition. They refer to transitioning from hydrocarbon fuels such as oil, gas, and coal to basically renewable electricity generated by wind and solar. And I think it's also commonly used to describe the process of electrifying transportation. So basically moving from cars or trucks powered by internal combustion engines, gasoline or diesel, to cars or trucks powered by electric batteries, otherwise known as EVs. And I think this is certainly a fair way to think about energy transitions. I think it only addresses part of the mega trend that's going to play out over the next 3 to 4 decades. So I'm going to actually broaden the question a little bit. And I like to think about it instead of energy transitions really as sustainability and decarbonization transition. I think that's really, I think energy transitions is like a sub theme of a much broader theme that I call sustainability and decarbonization transition. And because what's really behind the whole movement, the energy transition movement, is basically eliminating the emission of approximately 50 billion tons annually and growing, I might add, of new greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And then also removing hundreds of billions of tons of greenhouse gases that have previously been emitted in our atmosphere over the last century of industrialization. These hundreds of billions of tons of greenhouse gases that have previously been emitted, as well as the ones we're emitting every year, we've got to do something about that. And it's not just CO2. There's other things like NOx and SOx, nitrogen oxides, sulfur oxides, which are actually much more powerful greenhouse gases than just CO2. And so I think the Western world has become fixated on solving this problem in order to avoid what many people believe is more of an existential crisis or a climate crisis. And I think some of you may have picked up Bill Gates's book that he just released a couple of weeks ago. It's called How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And I think he actually sums it up quite well. And I don't know if he actually calls it the sustainability and decarbonization transition, but that's effectively what he describes in that book. And he correctly identifies the problem as not simply big oil destroying the earth, but that modern society emits tremendous amounts of greenhouse gases in many different ways. And that actually is what makes modern life possible. And so I think in this book, Gates, and what I found to be a very nonpartisan way, by the way, I think he clearly lays out the scope of our challenge in eliminating these greenhouse gases. And in order to successfully achieve the sustainability and decarbonization transition, we as a world have to do 2 things, I think. First, we have to focus on eliminating the emissions of greenhouse gases in 5 key categories. And it's kind of interesting, when I got his book, we actually had 5 categories. He has 5 categories. He calls them a little differently than what we call them, but essentially they're the same thing. And those 5 categories are these. And this is, I think, it's surprised in many people. Many of my friends that are, that love to throw stones at the oil and gas industry, did think this whole thing is about energy transitions, is about, the oil industry. But really, it's about multiple industries. And the biggest emitter of these greenhouse gases, of course, is what we kind of term building infrastructure and making things. I think Bill Gates calls it just simply making things. But these are basically the creation of cement, steel, and plastic, right? So the buildings we work in, the roads and bridges we drive on every day, the homes we live in, and really the many products that we use every day to make modern life possible. And that those things account for almost a third, about 31% of all greenhouse gas emissions. The second largest category of greenhouse gas emissions is generating power. So that's basically electricity. And this powers everything from the TVs we watch, the washing machines that we use, our computers, our iPhones, you name it. Even Bitcoin. I mean, the ironic thing about Bitcoin is if you think about Bitcoin, if it was a country, it'd be the 30th largest consumer of electricity in the world, just behind Norway and just in front of Argentina. That's pretty extraordinary fact. But power as a class consumes a little over a quarter or generates a little over a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions, about 27%. And then the third thing is growing things, basically the food that we eat, both the plants and the animals. And that's about 19% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation, ironically, is only about 16%. And that's everything from cars to trucks to planes to ships. And then lastly, what we use to kind of keep warm and cool, so air conditioners, heaters, refrigerators, that's about 7%. And so when you kind of frame up the problem in that way, all of a sudden, energy transitions is not just about, moving away from oil and gas and moving to renewables. The first thing we have to do is we have to make sure these greenhouse gases aren't emitted into the atmosphere from these activities. And we can do that by either finding alternative ways to do all these things that don't create the greenhouse gases to begin with. And that's going to take a long time and cost a lot of money to figure that out. Or we can capture those greenhouse gases, which principally is CO2, and then either permanently store them, likely underground, ironically in depleted oil and gas reservoirs. So we actually think the oil and gas industry is going to be one of the biggest saviors for the world when it comes to how do we store all these greenhouse gases that we're going to produce and or take out of the atmosphere. And that's called, you may have heard the term CCUS, or carbon capture, use, and sequestration. And then the second thing I think we have to do is develop ways to actually remove greenhouse gases. There's hundreds of billions of tons that are already in the atmosphere. We're going to have to take those out of the atmosphere, both the ones that are already in the atmosphere as well as the tens of billions of tons that will still be produced every year for the next many decades, because we're not going to go to zero emissions, tomorrow. And I think that frames up the energy transition. I would like to kind of talk, and again, I don't call it energy transitions, I call it sustainability and decarbonization transition. But let me just quickly hit, and I'll take 30 seconds to hit on your other part of your question. I think timing, it's going to take decades. I think several of the other panelists have mentioned that. If you look at the true energy transitions we've gone through in the history of the world, there's kind of been three big ones. The first one was coal. And by the time coal hit 5% market share, it took about another 50 years before it hit 40% market share, okay? If you look at crude oil, it took 50 years to go from 5% market share to 30% market share. If you look at natural gas, it took 50 years to go from 5% market share to 20% market share. Today, wind and solar are about at a 5% market share globally. And so how long is it going to take? I think those prior energy transitions are going to, at least a good indicator. Now, one might argue that, well, this is different because this is about survival. The other energy transitions were really about economics. And I think that's fair if you live in the West, right? If you live in Europe or you live in the US or Japan, that's fair. But that's about 1/7 of the world's population. The other 6/7 of the world population is basically trying to get themselves out of poverty. They're trying to attain lifestyles like we have here in the West. And that's not, saving the world's not first on their list. And so that's why I think it's going to, the world's going to continue to consume massive amounts of hydrocarbons for many decades in those countries alone. And that's, China and India are the two biggest culprits there. So, and then I think, Bobby mentioned kind of the cost of this. And I think that's going to be, I have a term I use for that. I'm not even sure it's in the dictionary, but I say it's beyond ginormous. And if you just look at the US, or really take North America, over the next 30 years, it's probably going to take $15 trillion just to transition to clean electricity and build the wind and solar and transmission lines globally is probably 80 trillion over the next 30 years. And that doesn't even begin to touch the other four categories I talked about. So this thing is going to cost hundreds of trillions of dollars. It's going to take many decades, and it's going to be massively more encompassing than just clean energy. So
it's going to fundamentally change lifestyles too. I mean, we've got to think differently about the way in which we live.
Yep.
Well, great perspective from everybody. And what we're going to do sort of right now is take questions from our legends. And it's great to see so many people have joined in. So let's start with Mort Meyerson. Mort is the founder of 2M and the Meyerson Family Foundation, also known as head of the Perot Systems and EDS. And Mort always sort of sits there and thinks hard and long and has great questions. So Mort, would you like to start?
Well, thank you. And maybe you should call me Amanda.
Yeah.
I want to join the group. So I have a comment first, and then I have a question. My comment is this weekend, I had guests at my house in Bozeman, where I am. You can tell by the mountains behind me. I had the guest, and I had a Montana State University professor, distinguished professor, who was a climate change environmentalist, who wrote the definitive report, which has been accepted by the government, the Montana state government, on the climate issues. And just in conversation with her, she said something that just blew my socks off. She said that Montana, where I'm sitting now, where I had 3 feet of snow on my front lawn a month ago, was not going to have snow within the next 50 years, according to her forecast. Now, a lot of people, there's a lot of reports like this. I'd never actually talked to somebody that knew something about this, and we had a long conversation about the implications for Texas. I asked about Texas, and she said water was going to be the big issue, and the climate, and then Arizona, you can just write that off. All right, so that's my comment. I thought that was intriguing given the conversation here. My question has to do with a subset of the energy area called minerals. Our family has been investing in minerals for quite some time, and I've followed the history of the Trail of Tears, the Native Americans who went to Oklahoma, and the Supreme Court case about minerals and who owns the minerals and who actually owns part of Tulsa, et cetera. And the Supreme Court came down on the side of the Native Americans, which in my narrow view seems to call into question who owns the minerals in Oklahoma, in a large part of Oklahoma, and the implications are for the United States. I talked to the chief negotiator for the Cherokee Native Americans, and I didn't get a clear picture of where they were headed in the negotiations. So I was wondering from the panel, is this an issue that appears to me to be huge, like who owns the minerals? And is this Native American Supreme Court case going to have implications for us?
Bill, do you want to take that one? Bill, you're on mute.
First, Mort, I'd say I haven't followed the litigation. I do deal with many minerals companies, including some of the largest minerals owners, and this is not an issue top of mind for them, but I'd let some lawyer involved in litigation talk. I will mention that in the United States, one reason why we have had such a dramatic expansion of our oil and gas production as compared to other parts of the world, as much as we may complain about government and regulation, is that we do have minerals that are owned by and large privately, except offshore where the federal government predominates. And that has aligned the interest of landowners and oil and gas, producers of oil and gas, about oil and gas exploitation. that's been a great blessing to the United States. If you consider the impact of oil and gas on our economy and our large hydrocarbon expansion. But, you know, maybe there's other panelists who follow that litigation a little bit more. I will tell you, it's not top of mind for some of the largest mineral owners in the United States.
Anybody else got a perspective?
I'd agree with Bill. I mean, we own a lot of minerals as well, and I don't think we have the kind of concerns here that one would have if we were, say, in Canada. You know, the Aboriginal rights in Canada have been taken a much higher level of precedent than they have in the U.S. So, but my personal belief, I don't think that's something that I'd be terribly worried about.
Let's move on then to our next question. Richard Fisher, happy to see you. Richard also gave us a Titan talk recently, and I got some information from Meredith about Richard's father, who spent a lot of time where I grew up. But Richard also has a unique perspective, given his background now as sort of senior advisor to Barclays, but he was former president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. So, Richard, your question.
Well, it's not so much a question as it is agreeing with the timeline that our panelists have articulated. I'll give you an example. I chair the ESG committee for Tenet Healthcare. I got the chairmanship because I missed the board meeting when they appointed the chairman of the ESG committee. And anyway, I've accepted it. This is a hospital company. We have 65 hospitals, 500 surgical centers. And if you think of the challenge of changing the entire structure of the way hospitals operate. There are 6.2 million hospital employees in the United States. There are 6,090 hospitals. They have to be able to perform, as we recently were tested here in Texas, for example, with the freeze out. They have to do their operations and provide their procedures no matter what, unless they're willing to face and are facing enormous litigation pressures. So if any one of our panelists is on the operating table and the electricity goes out, you have to find a replacement using a generator or some other mechanism. And then there's also the issue of how you store medicine, the plastics, all the stuff that is used to operate what is important as the backbone to our healthcare system. You cannot make a transition overnight. Most of these hospitals in the United States are dated. They have to figure out new structures. They have to raise new capital. And my point is simply not so much a question, but at least a comment, just as Mort made a comment based on his experience and my experience here in this sector. This will take decades to transition and to find new forms of reliable, sustainable, and fail-safe methods of generation of electricity for procedures, but also transitioning out from the important products that you use, which are the most commonly cited, as was cited earlier, cement, plastics, steel, that go into the construction and delivery of services. So that was a statement disguised as a question. Thanks for that.
Well, Richard, appreciate that. I think everybody is sort of focused on the timeline. It's going to happen. The question is, what is that timeline? And it's not going to be fast enough for certain people, and it's not going to take long enough in certain sectors for others. Kirk, always very direct. Kirk is a director. He's out of San Antonio and president of Zachary Exploration. Kirk, do you have a question for us?
Sure. I appreciate everyone participating in the panel discussion. That's a very interesting topic. So I sit right now in the upstream E&P sector. No doubt this transition is going to happen. I guess the thing we think a lot about, and the question around the opportunity and challenges of attracting talent in the midst of all this transition, and curious about each of your thoughts there. Obviously, the upstream sector is graying, it's getting older, and so it's something we think about often.
I'll speak to that, Amanda, if you don't mind.
I was actually, Barbara's going to call on you.
And we actually see this even in our business in the world of finance and finance in the energy sector. And our observation is that the problem that he just outlined, I think very directly speaks to why it is critical that the traditional energy business in the US, and in particular the upstream business, be seen as partners in helping to solve a problem, as opposed to purely commercial, entities. And our observation would be, if they are seen as partners in helping solve a problem, they will be able to attract high quality young talent from the current generation, because that talent will be drawn to the problem solving nature associated with transitioning to a lower CO2 emissions and more sustainable world. If the industry, however, is seen as a barrier to solving the problem, then the likelihood that we will be able to attract those same young people is much lower. So how the industry kind of positions itself, when I say the industry, I really mean the traditional hydrocarbon-based industry, how it positioned itself is critical to its ability to attract young talent, at least in our view.
Totally agree. David Robinson, also a director and managing director of Aon Risk Services, obviously looks at this industry and what's happening in a very different way. Comment and question for the panel? David, on your mute.
David just emailed me that he was having some problems getting on. Why don't we shift to the next question and see if he can get back on?
I will. Before we go, Kelsey, you've hired a lot of people and you've nurtured and brought a lot of people up in this industry. What do you think people are worried about most right now in the industry? Kelsey, you're on mute if you want to unmute first. Kelsey, do you want to unmute?
Yes, thank you. Part of that question cut out, so I think the part I heard, I'm sorry.
Kelsey, asking, what do you think people in the industry right now, employees, people, jobs, etc., are most concerned about?
Yeah, we are not having a problem attracting young people into our organization. I think it was well said just a moment ago. We educate them as to what we do and how important we are as a company, our partnership in our case. So we have not seen any issues at all. We have approximately 11,000 employees, and we're routinely in the market bringing new professionals, a lot of engineers, and so we're not seeing any issues at this point. And I watch it closely, but so far we're not.
Well, that's encouraging. Kevin Cumming, a partner at Juniper Capital, also a director. They've also made some investments in the Midland Basin here recently, upstream. Kevin, questions for the panel?
Yeah, my question is really more for those on the panel that are engaging directly with investors. So traditional energy is at an all-time low in terms of its percentage of the S&P 500. And it's been easy, I think, for investors to abandon oil and gas when oil and gas hasn't really provided much of a return, and say, well, for ESG reasons, we're going to abandon oil and gas when really it's maybe a little more return oriented, maybe. And so my question for those who are dealing with directly with investors, do you think that investors are demanding more emphasis or more focus on this energy transition, or as Will said, the sustainability and decarbonization transition? Or do you think, hey, if you guys are providing a good return, the investors are going to be there regardless? Just curious to hear what you guys have to say.
I could start if you want. Well, so far, let's say today, the relatively poor performance of having returns in excess of the cost of capital of the industry since 2014 has made that a easy choice for some of the active portfolio managers to reduce their exposure to energy. There are many different reasons for that, but traditional energy. They are thinking about, and on Chairman Lazard Houston, we have $300 billion under management on the other side of the firm, and it's a perennial topic, is the institutional investors do want their active managers to have some ESG screens, and particularly for greenhouse gas emissions. And those are evolving. To date, it's hard to discern a discernible impact on the cost of capital firm as a result of that. But it is a trend, and we do think that it will have a more pronounced effect on the cost of capital as time goes on. So,
Amanda, I might also add to that. I think clearly the lack of interest in the sector over the last few years has primarily been returns driven. But I will tell you, it is rapidly evolving, the focus on ESG. And so not just the E part, I think we tend to think about just the environmental when we think of energy transitions, but really the S and the G are very important as well. And so I do think when you look at the energy industry as a whole, it's actually not a very diverse industry. And diversity, we're about to raise our 8th fund and pre-marketing. And just talking to LPs in the last 3 years since we raised our last fund, I can tell you the ESG question has gone from probably number 15 on the list to number 1 or 2 on almost all of our investors. DDQs and their questioning of kind of what we're doing and how we're doing it. Clearly, methane emissions is an easy one. Flaring is another one that they're very focused on. But they are very focused on diversity, on inclusion. And I think our sector historically has not done a very good job at attracting, a lot of diversity. So I think that's going to be another big theme. And you're already seeing rating agencies just like S&P and Fitch and others for rating bonds. You're actually seeing ratings on companies now, giving them an ESG score. So I think going forward, it's going to be a much bigger. It's almost a right of if you're not exceptional at your ESG, I'm not sure you're going to be able to attract large amounts of capital. There'll always be small amounts of capital for anybody just seeking the highest return. But I do think that it's almost kind of your ticket to get into the game, if you will, is going to be, performing on the S and the G.
And I'm something there which last summer, there was a broad consensus in the investing world that the traditional energy business had become, quote, uninvestable. And Jim Cramer in particular was on record saying this is an uninvestable sector. Beginning December 1 till today, the single best performing sector in the S&P is the traditional energy business by a lot. So the notion that the traditional energy business has become uninvestable is actually just not borne out by the numbers. Now, the fact that it had become such a small percentage of the S&P was clearly influencing behavior. On the other hand, sometimes we probably make this more complicated than it really needs to be, which is to say, when oil price goes from 40 to 60, oil stocks go up. and the kind of the general perception had become we were stuck in a $40-something world where the companies could not generate returns above their cost of capital, to Bill's point. At $60, given where cost structures are these days, most companies in most places can generate a reasonable rate of return and a rate of return that's above their cost of capital. So the business does work at current levels. The business models have changed, and what investors want from the companies has changed. It has become much more focused on return of capital via dividends and share repurchase and debt pay down. So there clearly have been changes, but with that has become fantastic public company stock performance. So we have a saying around our firm that anyone caught saying it's different this time is fired on the spot. It still tends to be a highly cyclical business where the performance of the equities are quite tied to the perception of forward-looking commodity price. And that's still where we are.
I will say that, I mentioned that Solaris did the SLB linked bond, and, we went out 400 million, oversubscribed 2 billion plus. And the reason for that, not only, is the company, in good shape, making money, etc., but was the sustainability linked element certainly got that attraction, Will, to your point on ESG. Harry, Pafanis, who is president of Plains, I believe you've got a question for the group.
Yes, I do. I sit on the Association of Oil Pipelines Committee, and the committee's done some polling that would indicate, with broad spectrums of the population, that would indicate that most people are very supportive of a lot of the environmental sort of direction that is being pushed on the industry. But the polling also shows that most people are interested to the extent it doesn't cost them any money, or it costs them very little money. And once you get over the sort of that $20 to $50 a month range, they're more interested in having affordable, reliable energy. Has anybody else done any research or have any views on at what point does the public become more interested in reliable energy, affordable, reliable energy versus sort of some of these ESG efforts?
Kelsey, have you got a perspective?
Was that to me?
Yes, sir. Just wanted to.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Hey, Harry. Harry, we've not directly done that. It's good to see you on this. We've not done that, and I don't meet with investors anymore, Harry, as you know. I just get reports from our team, and this is something that they're discussing larger percentage of the time than I would have expected with investors. Harry, as you know, the equity markets have long since been gone for us. The MLP sector is in such disfavor that those of us like your company and Energy Transfer and a few others, we position ourselves well to live within our means. These kind of pipeline companies generate so much cash that we can fund our growth, and we can fund our existence, and including our distributions to our unit holders. So it's I think that will change. I do. I mean, I see what's going on with proposals to raise corporate income tax, and for many of the MLPs that might have thought otherwise and shifted to a corporation, I think they're probably going to regret that. And at some point, I think that the market, and someone said this earlier, the dollars will ultimately dictate this. I think that the market's going to recognize that MLPs are really a very attractive vehicle because you just pay tax once. Your unit holders pay it based on their tax situation. So I'm very optimistic, but where we are right now, we just don't go to the equity markets because it's just not there.
It's a new world. I'm going to sort of change gears a little bit and call on George Presses, who's VP of Fuel and Energy for HEB. And George has got a really interesting job in that, you think about HEB as our favorite grocery company. And yet his job is to try and figure out, fuel, energy transition, electric vehicles, what is the role that HEB plays? So George, I'm sure you've got a great question for the group.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda, and thanks to the panel. One of the challenges that we're trying to figure out is our role in this space. We're active in the retail business, both on the food and the fuel side. We're large industrial and retail users of of energy. We're investors in renewable energy projects behind our stores and at scale. One of the challenges that we have is we operate in Texas, and we're trying to message and balance the ESG message with our customers and our partners. We have pro ESG, we have some not so pro ESG messaging. What advice would you guys give us to balance that, to make sure that we stay HEB and that we don't get tied up in the broader debate about profitability, sustainability, how we fit within that, given everybody in Texas is our customer?
Bobby.
Yeah, I'll take a
Sure.
shot. George, this is Bobby Tudor.
Yes, sir.
My advice would be to follow the lead of the industry in framing the challenge in front of us as a dual challenge, which is to say to lower global greenhouse emissions and create a more sustainable economy and world, and at the same time provide affordable, reliable energy to consumers of energy, whether they're businesses like HEB or individuals heating their home or filling up their gas tank. And my perspective is that when faced with the reality that the challenge is in fact a dual challenge and not solely one of lowering greenhouse gas emissions, then the policy debate and sort of scope of solutions around it becomes a much more reasonable conversation, frankly. And admittedly, in the West, per Will's early comments, in the West, where we have such a huge standard of living advantage, arguably we can and should be willing to take more than our fair share of pain via higher costs to help drive the transition. Whereas if you are a subsistence farmer in China or India or Indonesia, you're going to see that in a different light. And this problem is truly a global problem. I think what's really important, not just for energy companies, but for all businesses, and in particular, all businesses in Texas, is that they be seen as partners and working to help address these dual challenges and not as a barrier to solutions. And I know from my history with HEB that you guys are very much in the former camp and not the latter, but I would encourage you to continue to be.
Thank you.
And Amanda,
Yes.
I would just add too that, thinking about your business, this is a little bit aside the point of pure greenhouse gas emissions as such, but for large and forward-thinking retailers such as yourself, this issue of single-use plastics is important. We know that 70% of it comes from about 7 river deltas that are not in the Western Hemisphere, but that's an issue that I think all retailers is going to be on the front line as people become more and more aware of what happens in the ocean. And of course, that does involve industries which are emitters that Will described.
Will, do you have a reaction?
Well, I think communication is key. I mean, this is a very politically charged topic, and it really creates very strong visceral reactions on both sides. And so I think, the problem is right now we've got half the population that's kind of in denial and half that thinks that they're on a mission to save the world. And so there's a lot of things it creates a lot of gridlock. And so I think, we've got to have candid conversations and leaders like HEB, I think, can be at the forefront of that. And you guys have a lot of data. You guys have you employ a lot of people. So you've got an audience. A lot of people like your store because, you give them great food and at a good price. And so, I think companies like HEB can be a real leader in helping to kind of foster dialogue on both sides. We need that, not just in Washington, we need that in, on this topic as well. But I think the other thing is we all have to just acknowledge, look, there's enough this thing has kind of hit a tipping point. And, I'm a big believer that we're not too far away in one form or another to pricing carbon and pricing all things that are kind of, greenhouse gas related one way or another, whether it's through government, laws, regulations, whether that's, just passing through taxes. I mean, there's all sorts of ways, but there is going to be a green premium on, emitters of greenhouse gases in some form or fashion. So I think getting ahead of that, leading, fostering dialogue, honest conversation, getting facts and figures out there. I think that's, if I were in your shoes, that's probably what I'd be thinking about.
Great. We've made some investments in renewable energy, some natural gas backup generation. We're trying to figure out our role in the EV space as hosts for electric vehicle charging, working and facilitating EV installations with utility organizations. With respect to greenhouse gas emissions, we're tackling our HVAC concerns and refrigeration leaks. We've got some mature stores similar to the Mr. Fisher's reference to mature hospitals. We're going back and making investments. We get an energy benefit as well as a GHG benefit. We're starting to quantify all that and message it. So it's important that we find a balance that's both suitable for our customers and our partners and broadly accepted by the public. And that's kind of the challenge that we're working on right now. So the feedback's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Amanda Eversole, so I'll call out the last names. You have a question.
I do. Thanks very much. So I am based in Washington, D.C. And so, we live inside the Beltway, are subsumed by politics each and every day. And so I hear as we've talked, and this has been an excellent discussion about ESG, and as we're talking about pricing on carbon and many things like that, these are all very much live topics here in Washington, particularly for the Biden administration. So I would welcome the panel's comments on the ability to ensure that we can continue to produce affordable, reliable, and cleaner energy, not just within the bounds of the Biden administration, but as we go forward. And I would say from the API perspective, that we've got a great story to tell as an industry and the value that we add to our communities, to our employees, and to citizens. And I think that for some reason, we tend to start by apologizing when we're talking about whether it's our carbon footprint or many other things. I think that, and I welcome your reaction to this panel, in terms of how you lead with the positive aspects of what we're doing, because again, I think that there is strength in this industry and our ability to continue to keep the lights on and to keep our population having access to the energy that we need is really critical. So would welcome your feedback with the lens of the political overhang, where we're seeing every regulator that's possibly connected to this, from the Federal Reserve to the CFTC, the SEC, is interested in climate. How do we help them come up with good solutions?
Elsie, why don't you take that one on?
I'll give an example. There is a particular situation in Latin America where power generation was being done with bunker fuel, and the emissions were poor, and the power was also had issues. So we invested to convert the power plant to propane, and then we built a solar farm that's under construction now, and we built a wind farm, all to help this generation get off of bunker fuel and switch to propane, which is the base load, and that's necessary with these other components. And I think I never hear anybody talking about investments that improve emissions where they actually money out. I hear a lot of talk getting into those investments in the U.S., but I think we all share the same environment, and we're pursuing more of those opportunities. We're looking at places where they're not blessed to have natural resources the way we are in the U.S., and where there's obvious no-brainers where we can dramatically improve the emissions from these facilities, and at the same time be competitive from a fuel standpoint. As I think a lot of people know, it's not really that economical to transport a lot of different fuels, but things like propane and ethane, we're finding the ethane market really growing right now, and we're really pleased with that. We're trying to catch up with it from a capital spend standpoint. So I would say if we can think a little bit more globally, and the impact we may be having elsewhere, where it makes a little bit more economic sense to have that impact, I think would be something I would recommend.
Any other perspectives?
Yeah, well, I'll jump in, Amanda. I'd say, well, there's multiple Amandas, but to first serve on communications, keep this in mind, big picture. In 2010, there was this battle on Capitol Hill, the Waxman-Markey bill, which was supposed to be the great, greenhouse gas legislation, comprehensive legislation. It had goals for the United States, emissions of greenhouse gases in 2020. It passed the House, didn't come up in the Senate because it didn't have the vote. It was a battle royal on which some energy companies, for reasons I understand completely, were in opposition. Environmental groups were in favor. The United States, after the defeat of that legislation, by 2016 surpassed the goal for reduction in greenhouse emissions relative to the 2020 benchmark. And it was because of the substitution of natural gas for coal. First point. Second, the people in order who are responsible for greenhouse gas emissions are, first of all, consumers who have control to some extent over their own carbon footprint. Second, it's governments who have the responsibility to make rules, regulations, tax systems about what and how things can be lawfully sold. And third, the companies themselves have responsibility under law to be fiduciaries for their shareholders. It's not the companies. I understand the ability of communications as to get ahead and to take leadership. And certainly there's a lot to live down from the days that there were people who minimized the risk of climate change or were climate change deniers. But there is a role for government, and we ought to make it responsible. The final point that I'll make is that actually, I think, we have a market system in the United States. People do tend to exaggerate the consequence of a change of administration. I've been doing energy policy since 1974, when I helped draft legislation that created the original CAFE standards and the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. They tend to overestimate who is president as opposed to market dynamics. And today, I think people exaggerate the role of the federal government compared to the states. The states are doing a lot of things I won't get into that have a big impact on energy transition that cumulatively will probably have more of an impact than the federal government.
Amanda, Bobby, really quickly, if I could add something just to follow on to Bill's comments. In the Obama administration, U.S. onshore oil production went from 4 million barrels to 8 million barrels. It's not because the Obama administration wanted that to happen. It was markets driven. Similarly, in the Trump administration, U.S. coal production from the day he entered office till the day he left was down 27%. That's not because President Trump wanted that to happen. It was a market driven reaction. And so to emphasize Bill's point, markets, and in particular technology, tend to be at least as important as policy in the world of energy systems, if not, frankly, a lot more important than policy in the world of energy systems. My one piece of advice for the federal government is to triple or quadruple down on fundamental research, whether it's in batteries or in green hydrogen or you name it. It's a fantastic role for the federal government to play. They're good at it. They know how to do it. There are brilliant people who work for the federal government and our national research labs. And I would hope that we could see fundamental research meaningfully ramped up by the federal government.
Great comments. Larissa Moon, San Antonio, she's a director. I know that she has a question.
So my question is probably a very difficult one to answer, but I contemplated a lot. I do a lot of work in California, which has the highest energy rates, as well as very little reliability with all their blackouts. And I live in Texas, where we just experienced, all of the unreliability during the cold storm. And Bill, I think you just mentioned, the debate of legislation, this whole, for years and years and different administrations. But what we don't have is any kind of transition plan that integrates all of these things. So my question is, how do we get our governments to actually step up and take that leadership to create that plan, instead of having these silos, whether it be the state or the federal government or the industries, all sort of fighting and working at odds? How do we get the leader to take a lead?
Well, let me just weigh in to say that, and this is an old debate that's gone on for, since really probably about the oil embargo, about national energy plan, national energy strategy. I would say, be careful what you ask for. Will mentioned, very thoughtful, good business person whose writings I would commend to anyone as well, Bill Gates, who has done a lot of study over a number of years. But if you have Congress create a national energy plan, which is binding on all sectors and all states, I think you're going to find some unintended consequences, just, for what it's worth. I mean,
I would agree.
The experimentation we have, we ought to learn from experience, as we should in Texas, on grid reliability based on what happened this February and February of 2011. What we ought to learn what's happening in California. But it's good that these things are occurring on the state scale as opposed to a national scale, which you might have if you have a national energy plan.
But do we have them at the state level? I mean, I guess I'm just looking to see if we have them at the state or the federal level.
Yeah, the question really is, what do you do? Well, for example, there are elements of the plan, such as Will had mentioned, carbon tax, which many oil and gas companies would favor as a reasonable way to rely on markets. But you need to be pretty sensitive. The market does a pretty good balance between this trade-off between what consumers want and public policies, and how intrusive you want to be on that market mechanism is an issue that concerns all of us. Should we do a better job of planning for electric reliability in Texas? I've been on record for decades as saying, since 1999, as saying that we have flaws in the system and it would cause a problem down the line. Yes, we ought to do that. But and there are states that have energy plans which are aspirational. My friend Mike Bloomberg used to say, plans that are made for 2050, it's sort of like a business having a plan for 2050, or some of the super majors saying that they're going to eliminate scope 3 emissions by 2050. Well, it just happens to occur when all those executives and board members are gone, or members of Congress are gone. That's why they choose 2050. I'd rather figure out, what are we going to do next? See how it works, take a next step, take it in bites. So that's my 2 bits for what it's worth.
Thank you.
And we got some time for additional questions. So next we're going to go to Graham Weston. So Graham is well-known founder of Space, Western Urban and Community Lab. So Graham, I'm sure you've got sort of some observations, if on nothing else, but can the federal government actually do good research? But I'm not going to have you answer that. But your question, sir.
So I guess, is there anything we can learn from the coal industry? We've seen the reason that coal has collapsed is because people have gone to alternate fuels. right? So ultimately, there was not it wasn't, at least my perception is that it wasn't really regulation, it wasn't government intervention. It was ultimately a trend toward other fuels for a number of reasons: cleaner, cheaper. I mean, obviously, natural gas being crazy cheap changed a lot of things. It seems like the transition, anyone predicting transition away from or desiring transition away from hydrocarbons really needs to fill in the blank, which is to say, what are we going to go to? And can that alternate fuel really be material enough to move the needle in the short term? Could you all just speak to that?
Well, why did you take that? Because I know you read a lot.
So, first thing I'll say is the easy wins have happened. If you look at renewable penetration over the last 10 to 15 years, we have put in a lot of wind. We're now putting in a lot of solar. And I say the easy stuff has happened for two reasons. One is we've taken a lot of the better real estate, so where the sun shines more and the wind blows more. But secondly, because wind and solar are intermittent, you can only have a certain percentage of the overall energy stack that's intermittent. You have to have base load, and base load is things that can be turned on demand, and that's typically hydrocarbons or nuclear. And so I think something we have to think about is as we go forward here, it's going to be a lot harder. We're going to have the investment in batteries to store the intermittent power, and also the investment in the grid is going to be essential to allowing us to continue to increase penetration rates for renewables. And the same thing that pipeline companies were facing, for example, with Keystone XL, and now with some other pipelines that it seem like to be in the news daily. DAPL is coming up here, I think, in a week or so. We've got to get, as a country, I mean, it kind of goes back to the questions: what's the government's role and what's private enterprise's role? And the markets, as Bobby pointed out, are really good at allowing, kind of sorting out this stuff. And, what we have to do from a federal government standpoint, I think, is, fundamental research, great. We've got to, China has clearly decided they're going to win in the renewable space, and they've created, unfortunately, some very big competitive advantages for their national champions. It's going to be hard to catch up. We have to think hard about that as a country. We have to clear out a lot of the regulatory hurdles, quite frankly, to getting, I think the same people that are opposing the pipelines are going to be, they are opposing the transmission lines. And, the average renewable project we build takes us 5 to 8 years to clear all the regulatory hurdles, and I'll just call it the public opposition. So everybody says they want it. They just don't want it anywhere close to where they have to see it. So I think the easy gains have been made. We're going to have to really invest in transmission. We're going to have to clear some of the red tape in terms of getting renewable projects built. And we're going to have to, as a country, we're going to have to figure out how do we store renewable energy? Because without that, I don't really know how much more we can do. It makes the system more unreliable. The more renewables we put on the system, the higher the probability we have another event like we had in Texas a month ago. And that's something that's, it's not acceptable. I mean, that cost our state, somewhere around $35 to $40 billion. So the challenges are pretty monumental, I think, in front of us here.
Would you just clarify, when you say invest in transmission, you're saying that if the wind energy is on the coast, that isn't where the demand is, so you have to move the power to where the demand is? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. When you look at where the best wind resource is in North America, it's generally up the center of the country, not a lot of population. And when you look at the best sun resource, it's in the southern part of the country. And so we've got to have a modern, I mean, our electrical infrastructure in this country is using 100-plus-year-old technology, and it's just not set up for the massive increase in load. I mean, just think about, as we shift, if we were to convert every car and truck in America to EV, our grid would melt down. It just can't happen. So, I mean, the investment in infrastructure to transport the electricity is going to be massive. We're going to basically replumb the whole country.
Bobby, do you have a perspective before we put it?
Well, I just circle back to my money question, billions of dollars to make this transition. And frankly, that's in and of itself part of the reason it's going to take such a long time. That much money is simply not available in the short term. And that even assumes that taxpayers in the developed world are willing to pay meaningfully more for power and for transportation fuel than they are currently paying. And you might check in with, President Macron in France, who had a bad experience when they decided to lift, diesel fuel rates. Look, at the end of the day, we live in one person, one vote democracies. And there's a reason that every time gasoline, this kind of goes back to Harry's early question, there's a reason why every time gasoline starts bumping up against $3.50 or $4, that politicians get really, really nervous, right? And they get nervous because they tend to be held responsible by the consumers of energy when that happens. And so this issue of being able to provide cheap, reliable energy is a real issue. And thinking about lowering greenhouse gas emissions sort of on a standalone basis without considering this other dual challenge is just it's a fool's errand.
So we're bumping up against time here. Dennis Nixon, Chairman and CEO of IBC, has a question, so we welcome that, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon now, I guess. My question is that we talk about renewable energy all the time, and as Will's pointed out, building out the infrastructure is a really big user of our damage to our environment. I always hear the positive side of green power, 3 or 4% of our countries now supported by that, but I never hear about the negatives, the cost to the environment of all the mining and all the construction and all the other things that have to go on to build these wind farms and the solar panels, and then most of all, the incredible toxic relationship we have with batteries and the disposal of all this stuff, because they have a limited life as well. So maybe a battery's 4 or 5 years, maybe a wind farm is 20 years and has to be completely redone, and all of the things that have to go on in the environment that are negative. So are we actually getting a plus environmentally out of wind power and solar and batteries? Are we really getting a plus?
Dennis, I always say green energy is not near as green as people think it is, and I think you just said that. And I think the oil and gas industry has done a pretty poor job of communicating. I always say we got a PR issue here. We've not done a good job, I think, of communicating the benefits. Everything in life is about a cost-benefit trade-off, right? Everything has a cost, everything has a benefit. And I think we've done a really poor job as an industry communicating the benefits that hydrocarbons bring to everybody. And I think we've done a really poor job talking about the negatives or the trade-offs, if you will, of green energy, which you've just you've listed a number of them. That said, I don't think we're very big supporters of green energy. We need to do everything we can to advance it. But I do somewhat worry, what's going to happen when the American public wakes up and realizes it's not near as green as everybody kind of was led to believe it is. Because in the media, I think just like in politics, unfortunately, creates very polarized views of topics. And this is one that's been very polarized. And I don't think the average American really does not understand the facts here. And they don't know what they're even asking for. They don't understand the reliability issues. They don't understand the cost issues. Are they willing to pay the cost? As we've talked, several people have talked about that topic. This thing is why this is going to take decades and decades and decades to play out. And, I, for one, am a huge believer in the future of the North American natural gas industry. I think we're in a great spot.
As a follow-up to that, I really feel like you're saying that the industry needs to do far more in educating people. I saw a very, very good video here a month or two ago that really laid that out in very, very precise terms. And really, I now question whether green is really absolutely the way to go at all. I mean, it really gave me deep concern that I hadn't really focused on. And so And when you're talking 50 years, and I've been in the banking business for 50 years, and we have never gotten most things right, and when you start modeling outcomes 50 years out in the future, I just have real concern about where we're going. I know we had a book published in the 70s called The Population Bomb, and the whole world accepted the fact that Earth was going to be overrun with people and that we were going to all die and starve to death. And that was all a big myth of environmentalists. And now here we sit today and we have a fertility problem and a population problem. And if population is going to be the problem we face going forward, and if we're going to be a planet that's dying off, which the demographers are now predicting, are we really fighting against an issue that doesn't really matter?
Amanda, could I have one comment?
Yes, sir.
Dennis, the greenest form of energy investment is in energy efficiency. The best way that individual consumers collectively can reduce greenhouse gas emissions is reducing the carbon footprint. And then I'll finally, and the cheapest way, the old-fashioned way to store carbon is photosynthesis. And when we think about the deforestation that is occurring in the Amazon while we're building thinking about building huge direct air capture plants in West Texas, I mean, it's absurd. It's absurd that we're thinking about spending all that money without spending the money on the most cost-effective means of storing carbon.
The pictures coming out of the Amazon are horrific. Kelsey, last word? Any observations?
Well, the gentleman that just asked the question, that number one, that took courage, and I love that guy. That was, people just don't say that enough. But can we challenge this logic that's going around that everybody just endorses? And I think that's, again, it takes courage to say that. And I just think that was excellent.
Thank you, Kelsey. Bobby, and then we will hand it over to Meredith. Any last comments?
It's a big challenge, but we've been up to big challenges before. And I actually have a high degree of confidence that the combination of American innovation and efficient capital markets will actually play a really big and important role in leading us to a cleaner future.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. And it's clear from the questions and all of your comments that, everybody has different opinions. This train has left the station. We are sort of on a journey. How long it takes, where it's going, yet to be determined. But the one thing I do have faith in, and that is, as humans, we do want to do good. We do want to take care of the environment as much as we can. It just gets to the point of what you can afford and how quickly it happens. So Meredith?
Yes, I'm sorry we are running a little bit late. I just want to thank our speakers. Amanda, I want to thank you for moderating today. I, of course, want to thank API for their sponsorship and support. To all of our Hall of Fame members and directors on this call and our speakers, I'm the luckiest person in the world because every day I get to see people who have the excuse to not have the time to do these things, but you always make the time. And that just says so much about you all. So thank you for supporting the Texas Business Hall of Fame, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. Have a good day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.